Limbo never existed, and the Vatican officially admitted it. The year is 1963. A young Catholic mother in rural Ireland gives birth to a son who never draws his first breath. The priest arrives, shakes his head, and tells her gently but without hesitation what the Church has taught for 16 centuries. Her baby cannot be buried in consecrated ground. He cannot receive funeral rites. He exists now in Limbo, a permanent borderland between heaven and hell, and she will never see him again. She believes this because the Church told her to believe it. The Church told her because Augustine said it, and Thomas Aquinas refined it, and the Council of Lyon codified it, and Pope Pius X's 1905 catechism repeated it plainly to a new generation of faithful. And then, in 2007, the Vatican published a document saying Limbo had never been doctrine at all. Let that settle for a moment. The International Theological Commission, an advisory body to the Vatican, released a document in January of 2007 titled The Hope of Salvation for Infants Who Die Without Being Baptized, approved personally by Pope Benedict XVI. The document stated explicitly that the theory of limbo represented a possible theological opinion that had never been defined as a dogma, and that the Church had not definitively settled the matter. 16 centuries, countless families, and the institution that taught it acknowledged, quietly, officially, in writing, that it had always been a hypothesis. To understand how this happened, you have to go back to Augustine of Hippo, born in 354 and dead by 430. Augustine was wrestling with the Pelagian heresy, which held that human beings could achieve goodness without divine grace. To combat this, Augustine argued that original sin was real, total, and required baptism for its removal. Infants who died without baptism were therefore in a state of original sin at death. They couldn't go to heaven. Augustine's own answer was bleak. They faced the mildest condemnation, his phrase, mitissima damnatio. Not quite hell, but not heaven either. Thomas Aquinas, writing in the 13th century in his Summa Theologica, softened this considerably. Aquinas argued that souls in limbo experience no punishment and no pain because they had committed no personal sin. What they lacked was the beatific vision, the direct experience of God, which is the defining quality of heaven. They existed in Aquinas' formulation in a state of natural happiness without supernatural fulfillment. This became the standard position. It was taught in seminaries, repeated in catechisms, and passed into pastoral practice as settled truth. The Second Council of Lyon in 1274 and the Council of Florence in 1439 both affirmed that souls dying in original sin descend to hell, though neither formally defined the specific conditions of limbo. The Council of Trent, which ran from 1545 to 1563 and defined an enormous amount of modern Catholic doctrine, also did not formally define limbo. This is the technical distinction the 2007 document relied upon. Limbo was never subjected to the formal definitional process that would make it irreversible church teaching. It was a theologumena, a theological opinion, operating at the level of hypothesis even as it functioned, in practice exactly like doctrine. And the practice was devastating. In Ireland, the burial of unbaptized infants in Chilini, unconsecrated and often unmarked burial grounds located outside the churchyard wall, continued well into the 20th century. Families were instructed that these children could not be buried alongside the baptized dead. Thousands of sites have been identified across the Irish countryside, small plots that became repositories of grief shaped by a hypothesis that was technically never required to be true. Pope Francis, speaking to an Italian Catholic newspaper in 2018, addressed this directly. In the past, there was the custom to not baptize children who died quickly after birth. Instead, they were buried outside the church without a funeral, as if it were a moment of joy. It is cruel. He concluded that the church's message today was one of reunion, that families would meet their children again. The mainstream position on all of this is careful and lawyerly. The church's theologians note that the distinction between hypothesis and dogma is real and technically meaningful. Limbo was never something you were required to believe as a condition of being Catholic. The pastoral practice that grew up around it, the denial of burial rites, the separation of graves, reflected a reasonable application of what was then the dominant theological opinion, not a deliberate institutional cruelty. Religious traditions evolve. Theological hypotheses are refined or retired. The 2007 document was not a reversal. It was a clarification of what had always been the technical status of the idea. But the technical truth and the lived truth are very different things. The distinction between hypothesis and defined doctrine is an insider's distinction invisible to the grieving mother in 1963 who was told by a priest in a position of spiritual authority what happened to her child. She wasn't handed a theology manual with footnotes about conciliar definitions. She was given a pastoral verdict, and that verdict, delivered with the full weight of institutional certainty for 16 centuries, rested on something that was, by the institution's own later admission, never definitively true. Some historians and theologians ask whether the Limbo episode reveals something structural about how religious doctrines function in practice. If a theological hypothesis can operate pastorally and socially with all the force of defined dogma, then the distinction between the two categories may matter far less than institutions suggest. And if one hypothesis of this magnitude could shape burial customs, family grief, and moral architecture across 16 centuries of Western civilization without ever being formally required to be believed, it raises a question that goes beyond Limbo. How many other confident answers in the history of religion, in the history of thought, have carried the weight of certainty they were never officially granted? We may never have a clean answer to that question. But the fact that it can be asked, with documentation, with dates, with the Vatican's own words, is something. From an institutional admission that reshaped how millions of people understand divine mercy, we turn to something older and stranger. Because long before the Church was debating where unbaptized infants go, another poet was drawing the most famous map of hell ever made. And he may have been copying someone else's work. Dante borrowed his hell from Islam, and someone new. In the early 14th century, a Florentine poet in exile began writing the most ambitious literary work of the medieval world. Dante Alighieri's Commedia, specifically the Inferno, gave Western civilization its dominant visual and architectural image of hell, a descending cone of concentric circles, each assigned to a specific category of sin, each with punishments precisely calibrated to the transgression they addressed. A first-person narrator, guided by a classical poet traveling downward through realms of increasing severity. A vision so complete and so vivid that it reshaped theological imagination across Europe and has never stopped doing so. It is considered one of the supreme achievements of Christian literature, except that in 1919, a Spanish scholar named Miguel Asín Palacios published a study identifying more than 500 structural, thematic, and narrative parallels between the Inferno and an Islamic text describing the Prophet Muhammad's own tour of hell and paradise, a text that had been translated into Latin 44 years before Dante started writing. The text in question is the Kitab al-Miraj, which translates roughly as the Book of Muhammad's Ladder. It derives from the Isra and Mi'raj tradition, the Prophet's night journey to Jerusalem and his subsequent ascent through the heavens, referenced in the Quran's 17th chapter. Extended narrative versions of this journey developed across Islamic literature from the 7th century onward, and by the 13th century, elaborate accounts of what Muhammad witnessed in hell and paradise had become significant literary and theological texts in the Islamic world. In 1264, King Alfonso X of Castile, known to history as Alfonso the Wise, commissioned the translation of the Kitab al-Miraj from Arabic into Castilian Spanish, and then into Latin, where it became the Liber Scale Machomedi, the Book of Muhammad's Ladder, and into Old French. Alfonso's court in Toledo was one of the great intellectual crossroads of medieval Europe, a place where Christian, Islamic, and Jewish scholarship met and exchanged. The translation was produced 44 years before Dante began writing the Commedia around 1308. Asin Palacios, a Catholic priest and professor of Arabic at the University of Madrid, cataloged the parallels with meticulous care. Both texts feature a first-person narrator who tours hell with a guide, Gabriel in the Islamic text and Virgil in Dante. Both describe hell as organized in concentric levels of descending severity, with punishments precisely matched to sins. Both feature a region of extreme cold at the innermost point for the worst of the damned. Both include the weighing of souls and the detailed administration of divine justice. Both describe specific physical torments for specific moral failures in language that, across translations, echoes with uncomfortable closeness. The counter-argument from Dante's scholars is that these parallels reflect shared sources rather than direct borrowing. Both traditions drew from Platonic and Neoplatonic cosmology, from the layered universe models that were common intellectual property across the Mediterranean world. Both drew from common Abrahamic afterlife imagery. The concentric hell structure follows from a cosmological framework available to any educated medieval thinker regardless of religious tradition. From this view, Asin Palacios found genuine parallels but drew an unwarranted conclusion. Similarity does not prove transmission, but then, in 1949, Italian researcher Enrico Cerulli discovered a previously unknown manuscript of the Liber Scale Machomedi in the Vatican Library, demonstrating definitively that the text had circulated in Italy in Latin and French. This shifted the conversation considerably. The text was not locked away in Spain. It was in Italy. It was in the language Dante read. It was in circulation among exactly the intellectual communities Dante moved through. There is also the matter of Brunetto Latini. Dante placed his own beloved teacher in the Inferno in Canto 15, honoring him even in damnation, which tells you something about how important Latini was to him. Brunetto Latini was in Spain in the 1260s, in precisely the period when Alfonso's translators were working. Whether Latini had direct access to the Liber Scale or its predecessors is not documented. But he was there, at that court, at that time. Dante never mentions the Liber Scale. He never mentions any Islamic source. He cites Virgil and Aristotle and Aquinas and Boethius extensively. Medieval scholars cited their sources. The silence is not proof of concealment. But some literary historians ask whether acknowledging a debt to Islamic literature in Florentine Christian intellectual culture of the early 1400s would have been professionally and socially impossible regardless of the debt's reality. If the Inferno's architecture was partly built on Muhammad's journey through hell, the silence might not be oversight. It might be the most revealing thing in the text. We may never close this question with the certainty required to rewrite the textbooks. But the Liber Scale existed. It circulated in Italy. Dante had the intellectual connections to encounter it, and the West's most famous hell map, the one that fixed the geography of damnation in the European imagination for 7 centuries, may have looked east for its blueprints without ever saying so. From a stolen map, or perhaps a parallel discovery, we move further east and much further back in time to a tradition that built hell not with stolen architecture, but with mathematics, naming its levels with the precision of a legal code and the obsession of a cartographer who refused to leave any room unmeasured. Hell in ancient India had more than 100 levels, and each one was named. Somewhere in the Gangetic Plain, more than 2,000 years before the Council of Trent formalized anything about Catholic doctrine, philosophers and theologians were constructing the most elaborately detailed underworld in the history of human thought. Not a vague realm of shadows, not a fiery pit, a system, a hierarchy, a taxonomy of punishment so granular that it assigned specific torments to specific sins, named the lords who administered each realm, described the roads connecting them, measured their dimensions in cosmic units, and calculated the duration of punishment in time scales that make geological epochs look brief. The Hindu and Buddhist cosmological systems of Naraka, the realm of punishment, represent an intellectual achievement of afterlife geography that has no equivalent in the Western tradition. The word Naraka appears in the Rig Veda, one of the oldest religious texts in the world, composed in the Vedic period somewhere between 1500 and 1200 before the Common Era, possibly older in its oral forms. In these earliest references, Naraka is a pit, a deep and sunless place for the wicked. But across the centuries that followed, through the Upanishads and the epics and into the vast literature of the Puranas, the concept was systematically elaborated with a thoroughness that suggests not gradual drift but deliberate construction. The Vishnu Purana names 28 primary hells, each with a specific designation and purpose. The Bhagavata Purana expands the catalog further. Across the range of Puranic texts, the named underworld realms number in the dozens, each described individually. A Tamisra is darkness, assigned to those who steal the possessions of others. Anhatamisra is extreme darkness, for those who commit adultery and break the bonds of sacred trust. Raurava is the realm of roaring, where a creature called the Ruru torments those who harmed living beings. Maharaurava is great roaring, for the selfish who lived only for themselves. Kumbhipaka means boiled in oil, reserved for those who killed animals for food. Kalasutra features a burning floor for those who disrespected their parents. The names are not random, they are descriptions. Every realm announces what it is. The Garuda Purana, compiled somewhere around 800 to 1000 of the Common Era, but drawing on considerably older traditions, takes this further. It provides what can only be described as a first-person afterlife travelogue. The soul's journey after death through the realm of Yama, the god of death and justice, including the specific roads taken, the rivers crossed, the gates passed, the weighing of accumulated karma, and the precise assignment to specific narakas based on a detailed moral accounting. The Garuda Purana is not casual theological speculation. It is recited at Hindu funeral ceremonies to this day. It is considered practical preparation for a journey the living know they will eventually take. Buddhist cosmology approaches the same territory with its own systematic rigor. The Pali Canon, particularly the Majjhima Nikaya, describes 8 major hot narakas and 8 cold narakas, a structure with deep roots in early Buddhist thought. Later, Abhidharma literature, the systematic philosophical elaboration of the Buddha's teaching, develops this into a structure of 16 subsidiary realms surrounding each of the major hells, producing a total cosmological count that some scholars have placed at 136 distinct underworld realms across the full system. Each has environmental conditions, each has assigned populations, each has a duration, and here is perhaps the most philosophically significant fact about the entire system. In both Hindu and Buddhist cosmology, Naraka is not eternal. This is not a minor footnote. It is the structural foundation of the entire framework. Beings are reborn into Naraka as a direct consequence of karma. The punishment they experience is proportional to their actions, calibrated to the weight of what they did and the intention behind it. And when the karmic debt is exhausted, they are reborn elsewhere. The duration of punishment can be expressed in kalpas, cosmic time cycles that some texts associate with periods of approximately 4.32 billion years. These are numbers that dwarf any human intuition of duration. But they are finite. The mathematics of justice in this system always eventually resolves. The figure of Yama, the divine judge of the dead, is itself an ancient puzzle. He appears in the Rig Veda as one of the first mortals to die, the one who blazed the trail for humanity into the realm of death. He appears in Avestan tradition, the language of the Zoroastrians, as Yima. Comparative mythologists have argued that both figures descend from a Proto-Indo-European ancestor, a divine death judge whose concept is old enough to predate the separation of the Indo-Iranian and European branches of the language family, potentially placing the origin of this theological figure before 3000, before the Common Era. If that argument holds, then the administrative architecture of the underworld, a divine judge, a moral accounting, a realm of consequence, is among the oldest recoverable ideas in human thought. Mainstream scholars of Indian religion read the elaboration of Naraka as a natural and sophisticated consequence of karma-based theology. If action produces consequence, and if the scales of justice must balance with precision, then the afterlife realms where that balancing occurs must be correspondingly precise. The detail of Naraka descriptions reflects the philosophical rigor of a tradition that took moral causation seriously at a systematic level. The Puranic authors were not mapping a real place. They were building a logical architecture for a theological concept that demanded internal consistency. But some researchers in comparative religion note something that the parallel development explanation doesn't quite dissolve. The same basic administrative architecture, a divine judge, a moral weighing, a hierarchical realm of specific punishments matched to specific sins, a guide and traveler structure, appears in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in Greece, in India, in China, and in Mesoamerica, in traditions with no demonstrable contact with one another. The emotional theme of consequence after death is universal enough to explain convergent development. What is harder to explain by parallel invention alone is the consistency of the bureaucratic structure. The filing system, the named officials, the specific roads. Some scholars, including the mythologist Joseph Campbell in his work on cross-cultural patterns, have asked whether the human mind carries structural templates for organizing the unknown that produce similar frameworks independently. Others ask a sharper question: why is the underworld, across cultures, almost always more precisely mapped than heaven? Why is the geography of punishment more exact than the geography of reward? What does it mean that humanity's most detailed shared cartography is a map of hell? We don't have an answer, but we do know where the most visually dramatic version of that map was built. And it wasn't in a library. It was underground, beneath a ball court, in the jungle of the Yucatan. The Maya built a map of hell beneath their cities and played games over it. Beneath the great ball court at Chichen Itza, one of the most visited archaeological sites in the Western Hemisphere, the limestone of the Yucatan Peninsula dissolves into darkness. Flooded passageways, some of them wider than city streets, connect sinkholes across hundreds of kilometers of connected cave systems. The Maya called the underworld Xibalba. They didn't position their cities near its entrance. According to the evidence accumulated over more than a century of archaeology and over the last 2 decades of underwater exploration, they positioned their cities directly above it. The sacred cenote at Chichen Itza was first investigated in a sustained way by American archaeologist Edward H. Thompson, who began dredging its depths starting in 1904. What he pulled up over the following years included approximately 30,000 artifacts, gold discs, jade ornaments, rubber objects, obsidian blades, incense, and the skeletal remains of at least 42 individuals, men, women, and children, deposited over an extended period spanning multiple centuries. The cenote was not a coincidental landmark. It was a sustained ritual destination, a place where the Maya conducted deliberate and repeated engagement with what they understood to be the literal geography of the underworld. The Popol Vuh, the Quiché Maya creation text written down around 1550 but reflecting oral traditions of considerably older origin, describes Xibalba with a specificity that is extraordinary for mythological literature. It names 12 specific ruling lords of the underworld, 1 death and 7 death at the top of the hierarchy, followed by Pus Master and Jaundice Master, and then the lords of the specific houses of trial through which the hero twins must pass. There is the dark house, total darkness within. The cold house, rattling with impossible chill. The fire house. The razor house, filled with cutting blades that move on their own. The bat house. Each house is a named environment with specific physical properties. The Popol Vuh is not vague about what the underworld is like. It is specific enough to follow as a set of directions. The Yucatan Peninsula sits atop a limestone karst platform laced with what is currently understood to be among the most extensive flooded cave networks on Earth. In 2018, the Gran Acuífero Maya project, led by underwater archaeologist Guillermo de Anda of the National Autonomous University of Mexico, announced the connection of the Sac-Actin and Dos Ojos cave systems, producing a single mapped network of approximately 347 kilometers in length at that time, making it the longest known underwater cave system in the world. The project has continued mapping since. The full extent of what lies beneath the Yucatan is not yet known. What de Anda's team has found inside these systems is not simply natural cave. Ritual objects including censers, jade, obsidian blades, and human remains have been documented in cave chambers accessible only to skilled underwater divers in complete darkness, hundreds of meters from any surface opening. These are not accidental deposits. Something was placed there deliberately, at considerable physical effort, and in locations that no casual visitor would ever reach. The spatial intentionality of the deposits suggests that the Maya were not simply treating the caves as symbolic of the underworld. They were treating specific chambers as specific locations within its geography. In 2019, de Anda's team confirmed the existence of a cave directly beneath the Temple of Kukulkan, the great pyramid known as El Castillo that dominates the center of Chichen Itza. The pyramid, built with extraordinary astronomical precision so that its shadow produces the image of a descending serpent at the spring and autumn equinoxes, appears to have been constructed deliberately above a pre-existing underground chamber. The builders knew the cave was there. They chose to build above it. The Great Ball Court at Chichen Itza, which measures 168 meters long by 70 meters wide and is the largest known ball court in Mesoamerica, sits in deliberate spatial relationship to the cenotes. The game played there, puck to puck, was not recreational, it was cosmological. The rubber ball represented the sun. The court represented the cosmos. The game itself reenacted the journey of the hero twins through Xibalba, described in the Popol Vuh, their death in the underworld, their resurrection, and their transformation into the sun and moon. The players who competed on that court were not athletes in any modern sense. They were ritual participants in a drama whose stakes were understood as cosmic. Mainstream archaeology reads all of this as evidence of a sophisticated religious culture that used the remarkable natural geography of the Yucatan, its sinkholes, its cave systems, its flooded passages, as the physical substrate for a powerfully developed theological imagination. The cenotes were sacred because of their visual drama, sudden openings in the earth dropping into dark water, and because water was life in a region with no surface rivers. The positioning of architecture above caves reflects genuine spiritual intention. The Popol Vuh's detailed underworld geography is extraordinary mythological literature shaped by a real physical landscape. The Maya were doing what human beings do, finding the sacred in the terrain they inhabited. But De Anda's team keeps finding objects in places that challenge the inspired mythology explanation. Deposits in chambers accessible only by skilled underwater navigation. Artifacts in complete darkness, requiring deliberate placement by people who knew what they were doing and had done it before. Some researchers ask whether the Maya's underworld geography represents something beyond theology encoded in myth, whether the named houses of Xibalba, specific environments with specific physical properties, darkness, cold, cutting air, might correspond to real identifiable chambers within the cave network, whether the Popol Vuh might function, in part, as a guide for underground navigation encoded in cosmological language. Whether the extraordinary specificity of the text reflects not just theological imagination, but empirical knowledge of what the caves actually contain. We don't know. The cave network is still being mapped. New chambers are still being found. What the Maya knew about what lay beneath their cities and how they came to know it remains one of the genuinely open questions of pre-Columbian archaeology. From a civilization that mapped hell into the physical earth of the Yucatan, we move across the Atlantic and forward in time to the moment when Western Christianity nearly lost one of its oldest and most dramatic claims about what happened to its central figure between his death and his return. Jesus descended into hell, and the church nearly erased it. Every week, in churches across every continent where Christianity is practiced, billions of people recite the Apostles' Creed. They say it often enough that the words lose their edges, become a rhythm rather than a statement. But buried in the middle of that rhythm is one of the most theologically explosive and institutionally contested sentences in the history of Christian doctrine. He descended into hell. 3 words. 7 centuries of ferocious disagreement about what they mean, whether they belong, and whether they should be said at all. The scriptural basis for what theologians call the harrowing of hell, Christ's descent into the underworld between his death on Friday and his resurrection on Sunday, is thin but genuinely present in the text. The first letter of Peter, in chapter 3, describes Christ going to preach to the spirits in prison who were disobedient long ago. The letter to the Ephesians, in chapter 4, refers to Christ descending to the lower parts of the earth. The second chapter of Acts quotes the 16th Psalm. You will not abandon my soul to Hades. These passages are brief and their interpretation is contested, but they are there. The earliest unambiguous reference to Christ's descent beyond Scripture appears in the Epistula Apostolorum, a text dated to approximately 140 to 160 of the Common Era, and in the writings of Irenaeus of Lyon, who lived from approximately 130 to 202. Irenaeus describes Christ visiting the dead and offering them salvation in language that treats the event as straightforwardly real. For the first 12 centuries of Christianity, the harrowing of hell was among the most vividly depicted events in Christian art, drama, and preaching. The phrase descended into hell in its Latin form, descendit ad inferos, appears in the Aquilian form of the Apostles' Creed, dating to approximately 390 of the Common Era. but it is absent from earlier creedal formulas, including the Roman form from around 340. The inclusion was not universal from the beginning. It was added, which means it had a history of being absent before it had a history of being present. The Gospel of Nicodemus, also called the Acts of Pilate, a non-canonical text dating possibly to the 4th or 5th century, contains an extended narrative of the harrowing that became enormously influential on medieval culture. In it, Christ physically confronts Satan at the gates of hell, breaks them, and liberates Adam, Eve, the patriarchs, and the prophets in a scene of extraordinary dramatic power. This text had no canonical authority, but it shaped popular theology more powerfully than many canonical texts precisely because it was visual, dramatic, and concrete, a story rather than a doctrine. Medieval Christian art treated the harrowing as central rather than marginal. Mystery plays performed across Europe from the 12th century through the 16th depicted Christ's descent with theatrical elaboration. The image appeared on church walls, in illuminated manuscripts, in carved stone. But in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, the harrowing is not simply one doctrine among many. It is the central image of the resurrection itself. The icon called Anastasis, which means resurrection in Greek, does not show an empty tomb. It shows Christ standing on the broken doors of hell, reaching down with both hands to pull Adam and Eve upward by their wrists, while Satan lies bound beneath his feet. This is the resurrection icon of the Orthodox Church, not the empty tomb, the harrowing. Then came John Calvin. In the Institutes of the Christian Religion, first published in 1536 and significantly expanded by 1559, Calvin reinterpreted the descent clause entirely. He argued that it referred not to a literal visit to the underworld, but to Christ's spiritual suffering on the cross, the experience of divine wrath that was the equivalent of hell. Calvin found a literal descent theologically problematic. His reinterpretation was influential and widespread. It also created a fracture in Protestant interpretation that was never healed, because it could not be reconciled with the Orthodox understanding, which had never required reinterpretation in the first place. Several Protestant denominations have since removed or modified the descent clause in their versions of the Apostles' Creed. Some replace "He descended into hell" with "He descended to the dead," which softens the statement to a claim about mortality rather than a claim about location. The United Methodist Church's official hymnal includes a note explaining that the phrase is interpreted in various ways. What was for 12 centuries a vivid and central event in Christian theology has become, in much of Western Protestantism, an awkward sentence in need of a footnote. Dr. Matthew Emerson, in his 2019 work on the doctrine published by IVP Academic, argues that this near erasure represents a genuine theological loss, that the early church understood Christ's descent as an expression of solidarity with the dead, a claim that salvation reached not just the living, but all who had died before the incarnation. If you remove or spiritualize the descent, you remove something that the early church considered structurally important to what salvation means. Some historians ask whether the Reformation's fracturing of the doctrine reveals something about how institutions handle inherited claims they find inconvenient. The descent clause was not removed because new evidence challenged it. It was reinterpreted by Calvin, softened by later Protestants, and eventually bracketed as a matter of individual interpretation because it created theological complications that were easier to dissolve than to resolve. A doctrine recited by billions for 12 centuries became, in several major traditions, an optional statement. And the fracture happened not through scholarship, but through institutional preference. The question that leaves open is whether it was the first such fracture or simply the most visible one. From a doctrine that nearly disappeared from the Creed, we moved to a text that was never in the Creed, but shaped the popular theology of hell more powerfully than almost anything else. The name people have been calling hell for 2,000 years, which turns out to be a specific valley outside Jerusalem that you can visit with a map. Gehenna was a garbage dump outside Jerusalem, and its name became the word for hell. Stand on the southwestern edge of the old city of Jerusalem today, walk down the slope, and you will find yourself in a valley. It runs for approximately 600 meters, bounded by stone and soil, unremarkable to the modern eye except for its history. This valley is Gehinnom in Hebrew, which translates as the Valley of the Son of Hinnom. In Greek it became Gehenna, and in most English translations of the New Testament, Gehenna is translated as hell. Jesus uses this word 12 times in the Synoptic Gospels. For 2,000 years, readers have taken it as the name of a supernatural realm of eternal punishment. The word was a proper noun referring to a geographic location, and the geographic location was, by some accounts, the city's garbage dump. The valley appears first in the Hebrew Bible as a boundary marker. Joshua 15 and Joshua 18 both reference the Valley of Ben Hinnom as a geographic demarcation. But its religious significance appears in 2 Kings chapter 23 and 2 Chronicles chapters 28 and 33. There the valley is described as the site of Tophet, a place where children were burned as sacrifices to the god Moloch during the reigns of Kings Ahaz and Manasseh, roughly 735 to 642 before the Common Era. King Josiah, who reigned from approximately 640 to 609, desecrated the site to end the practice. He made it ritually impure, permanently defiled. Jeremiah, writing in the late 7th and early 6th centuries before the Common Era, delivered a divine pronouncement over the valley that began the process of its theological transformation. In chapter 7 and again in chapter 19, Jeremiah declares that the Valley of Hinnom will become the Valley of Slaughter, filled with the unburied dead, a place of infamy and divine judgment. This prophetic reframing is crucial. It transformed Gehinnom from a geographic site of historical horror into a symbolic landscape of divine punishment. By the period of Second Temple Judaism, roughly 300 before the Common Era to 70 of the Common Era, Gehenna had developed as an apocalyptic term for a realm of post-mortem punishment in texts including 1st Enoch, 4th Ezra, and 2nd Baruch. These texts were not canonical scripture, but were widely read and theologically influential. By the time Jesus was teaching, the word Gehenna carried both its literal geographic meaning and this developing symbolic weight simultaneously. The word had not yet fully shed its address. The theory that the valley functioned as Jerusalem's first-century garbage dump, where fires burned continuously to consume refuse, was articulated most influentially in the medieval period by the Rabbi David Kimhi, who lived from approximately 1160 to 1235, and was later popularized in the 19th century by the German scholar Johann David Michaelis. Under this reading, the continuous fires of Gehenna were the fires of a municipal waste facility, and Jesus' description of a place where the worm does not die and the fire is not quenched, drawn from Isaiah 66, would have resonated with anyone who had seen the valley's perpetual burning. But modern scholars, including Dr. Todd Bolin, have challenged the garbage dump theory, noting that direct first-century archaeological evidence for this specific usage is limited. The symbolic pollution of the site is not in doubt. The continuous burning fires are disputed. What is not disputed is the translation choice. When the New Testament writers used Gehenna, they were using a Greek transliteration of a Hebrew proper noun, the name of a specific valley with a specific location and a documented history. When later translators rendered that proper noun as hell, they made a choice. to transform a geographic name into a theological concept, flattening a specific address into a universal category. Some modern translations have moved away from this, rendering Gehenna as Gehenna, preserving its geographic specificity and leaving the theological interpretation to the reader. Most major English translations have not. A strand of biblical scholarship associated with the preterist interpretive tradition, among others, has argued that Jesus' Gehenna language was not primarily a description of post-mortem fate, but a warning about coming historical catastrophe. Specifically, the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in 70 of the Common Era, which resulted in mass slaughter, unburied bodies, and the precise conditions of the valley's prophetic description in Jeremiah. From this reading, when Jesus warned that those who followed a certain path risked Gehenna, he was issuing an urgent near-term political prophecy aimed at first-century Judeans, not a description of eternal punishment awaiting all sinners in all times. The mainstream view among biblical scholars is that this preterist reading, while textually defensible for some passages, cannot account for the full range of Gehenna's New Testament usage, some of which seems to refer to consequences beyond any historical event. The prevailing position is that by the 1st century, Gehenna had fully developed apocalyptic and eschatological connotations, and that Jesus' audiences understood it in that developed sense, the way we might understand Watergate as referring to corruption rather than a hotel. But the gap between the mainstream and alternative readings has consequences. If Gehenna was primarily a historical warning, then the theological edifice of eternal hell built on that word rests on a category error of world historical proportions. And if the word was always purely symbolic by the 1st century, then the 2,000-year tradition that treated hell's geography as spatially real, underground, structured, measurable, was built on a metaphor that was read backward into a literalism it never claimed. Either way, a specific valley outside a specific city contributed its name to a theological concept that shaped Western civilization's understanding of divine justice, and not many people who use the word know that they could, in principle, visit the place it came from. From a valley in Jerusalem that gave hell its most common name, we descend further back into the silence of the oldest Hebrew conception of what happens after death, and discover that the original underworld of the biblical tradition was not fire at all. It was quiet and cold, and it made no distinction between the righteous and the wicked. Sheol, hell, was originally cold and silent and equal. Before fire, before Satan, before the 12 named lords and the concentric circles and the precise matching of punishment to sin, before any of it, there was Sheol. And Sheol was nothing like what you've been told. The Hebrew word Sheol appears 65 times in the Hebrew Bible, in texts spanning from the earliest layers of the tradition, possibly as old as the 10th or 9th century before the Common Era, through the post-exilic period. It is translated in various English Bibles as hell, as the grave, as the pit, as the realm of the dead. In the original, it is none of these exactly. Sheol is the place where everyone goes, not the wicked, everyone. In the book of Job, written in a literary tradition, scholars often date to the 7th or 6th century before the Common Era. The text is explicit. Chapter 3 has Job crying out that he wishes he had died at birth so that he would now be in Sheol, where the wicked cease from troubling and the weary are at rest. The wicked and the weary, together, resting. Job is not describing punishment. He is describing relief. Sheol is the place where the grinding weight of life finally stops for everyone who has ever lived, regardless of how they lived it. The book of Ecclesiastes, in a tradition often associated with the wisdom literature and generally dated to the 3rd century before the Common Era, states in chapter 9, There is no work or thought or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol to which you are going. No knowledge, no wisdom, no continuation of the self as a knowing entity. The Hebrew conception of the afterlife in its oldest form is not punishment, it is cessation. A shadowy diminishment of existence in which the dead are present but not truly alive, dimly aware but not genuinely conscious. The prophet Isaiah, in chapter 14, provides one of the most vivid Sheol descriptions in the entire Hebrew Bible. When the king of Babylon descends to Sheol, the shades of the dead, called Rephaim, stir themselves from their seats to greet him. They say, "You too have become as weak as we are. You have become like us." This is the horror of Sheol in the Hebrew imagination. Not fire, not torment, equality. The great brought low to the level of everyone else, stripped of power, stripped of distinction, subsiding into the same gray diminishment that awaits every human being without exception. The physical description of Sheol across the Hebrew texts is consistent in its bleakness and its silence. It is located downward, in a general sense associated with depth and darkness. It is dusty. In the Psalms, it is called the pit multiple times, suggesting a bounded, contained space. Psalm 88, one of the darkest poems in the collection, describes Sheol as the land of forgetting, a place where even the memory of God is absent. Not a place of relationship with the divine, punishing or rewarding. A place of absence. What Sheol is not in any of its earliest forms is a place of moral sorting. The specific Hebrew division between a realm of punishment and a realm of reward comes later, under the influence of Persian Zoroastrian theology during and after the Babylonian exile of the 6th century before the Common Era, when Jewish thinkers were in sustained contact with the tradition that had developed a more fully articulated cosmic dualism, including a clear distinction between the fate of the righteous and the fate of the wicked after death. The transformation of Sheol from a universal gray realm to a divided territory and then to a punitive one is not a static inheritance. It is a development with a traceable history. By the Second Temple period, the literature shows clear evidence of this transformation in progress. First Enoch, written in stages from approximately the 3rd century before the Common Era through the 1st century of the Common Era, describes a divided underworld with 4 distinct chambers, one for the righteous, one for sinners who were punished in life, one for sinners who were not, and one intermediate space. The division that would eventually produce the fully elaborated hell of the New Testament and later Christian theology is being assembled in real time across these texts. But it had to be assembled. It was not always there. Mainstream biblical scholarship reads this development as a natural and appropriate theological evolution. As Jewish theology deepened its reflection on divine justice, particularly in the context of persecution and martyrdom during the 2nd century before the Common Era under Antiochus Epiphanes, the question of why the righteous suffer and the wicked prosper demanded a more robust answer than Sheol's gray equality could provide. The development of a differentiated afterlife was a theological response to a genuine moral problem. It was not import or invention, but growth. But the trajectory has a specific direction, toward punishment, toward duration, toward specificity, and toward fire. And some scholars of religious history ask why that direction was so consistent. Sheol's silence was theologically honest in a way that fire is not. It acknowledged what the living actually know about death, which is that the dead are gone, and it said nothing further than the evidence warranted. The elaboration that followed, centuries of increasingly specific punishment, increasingly named administration, increasingly precise calibration of torment to transgression, served purposes that silence could not serve. It answered the desire for justice. It created the machinery of deterrence. It gave institutions a geography to point to. Sheol asked only that you accept mortality. What replaced it asked considerably more. And the being who supposedly administers what replaced it, the figure everyone assumes is running the whole operation, is the subject of one of the oldest and most persistent lies about hell in the entire tradition. Because he was never in charge, he was never even supposed to be there. Satan doesn't rule hell, and never did. Picture the image. You know it instantly because it is everywhere. A red-skinned figure on a throne of bone and fire, hooves planted on the skulls of the damned, horns curving upward, surrounded by the sounds of eternal torment. The king of hell, the lord of damnation, the administrator of divine punishment in the realm below. This image is so pervasive, so thoroughly embedded in Western visual culture, from Halloween decorations to heavy metal album covers to 3 centuries of horror cinema, that it feels ancient, foundational, biblical. It is none of these things. The Hebrew word that eventually became Satan is a common noun. It is the word Satan, spelled with the Hebrew letters Shin, Tet, Nun, and it means adversary or accuser. It is a legal term from the vocabulary of the courtroom. In the book of Numbers, chapter 22, the angel of the Lord himself is described as a Satan, an adversary, blocking the path of the prophet Balaam. The word is used as a title, a function, a role in a proceeding. Not a name, not a being, a job description. The most sustained portrait of the Satan figure in the Hebrew Bible appears in the book of Job, generally dated by scholars to somewhere between the 7th and 4th centuries before the Common Era. In the opening chapters, the sons of God, the Bene Ha-Elohim, present themselves before God in what the text describes as a divine assembly, a heavenly court. Among them is the Satan, who has been going to and fro on the earth and walking up and down in it. He is a member of the court. He reports to the judge. When he proposes the testing of Job, he cannot act without explicit divine authorization. He has no independent power. He is not a rebel monarch ruling a rival kingdom. He is a prosecuting attorney making a case with the judge's permission in a court the judge controls. The Satan of popular imagination, the being with a throne in hell and dominion over the damned, derives not from this figure, but from a long sequence of textual conflations, cultural borrowings, and literary inventions. The elaboration began in the extra-biblical literature of Second Temple Judaism. First Enoch, written in stages from approximately 300 before the Common Era onward, develops the idea of fallen angels, divine beings who rebelled and were punished. The Book of Jubilees similarly elaborates on a figure of cosmic opposition. These texts were not canonical, but they were widely read and theologically influential, and their expanded Satan figure began bleeding into the tradition. The Zoroastrian theological tradition, with its fully developed cosmic dualism between Ahura Mazda, the supreme good deity, and Angra Mainyu, the supreme evil principle, provided a framework that shaped how Jewish and later Christian thinkers conceived of cosmic opposition. The extent to which Zoroastrian influence directly shaped the developing Satan figure, and through which specific transmission pathways, is actively debated by scholars of religion. But the structural similarity between Angra Mainyu and the developed Christian Satan, an independent cosmic adversary of comparable, if lesser power, to the supreme deity, has no equivalent in the earliest Hebrew texts. Something changed, and the change has a direction that points toward Persia. The visual image of Satan with horns, hooves, and red skin is a later addition still, derived largely from the conflation of the developing Satan figure with the Greek god Pan and the Roman Faunus. Rural, goat-hooved deities associated with wilderness, lust, and the uncontrolled margins of civilization. Early Christian evangelism in the Greco-Roman world found it useful to identify pagan deities with the forces of evil, and Pan's physical attributes migrated onto the Satan figure in popular iconography over the course of several centuries. The image solidified in the medieval period, when illuminated manuscripts and church carvings needed a recognizable figure of evil that their audiences would immediately read as threatening. Dr. Elaine Pagels of Princeton University, in her landmark 1995 study, traces how early Christian communities systematically transformed the Satan figure from a heavenly prosecutor into a cosmic enemy, and specifically how this transformation served the social function of demonizing opponents, whether Jewish communities, pagan authorities, or rival Christian factions. The Satan who began as a function in a divine courtroom became a screen onto which any enemy could be projected. And as the enemies of Christianity shifted and multiplied across centuries, Satan expanded to accommodate them. In the New Testament's book of Revelation, chapter 20, verse 10, Satan's fate is made explicit. The devil, who deceived them, was thrown into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. Satan is in hell as a prisoner, as a victim of its torments, as the one being punished. He is not administering the punishment. He is receiving it. And then there is John Milton. Paradise Lost, published in 1667, is one of the supreme achievements of English literature. It is also, for most Western readers, the source of the most vivid and detailed portrait of Satan ever put into words. Milton's Satan is majestic, eloquent, tragic, defiant. He is the one who says, in Book 1, that it is better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. That line is not scripture. That line is a 17th century English poet's invention, written to explore the psychology of rebellion and pride. Milton never claimed it was otherwise. But the line entered popular consciousness as though it confirmed something ancient, and in doing so, it finished the construction of a Satan who was never in the oldest texts, a king who chose his throne. The being who rules hell in the Western popular imagination is a composite assembled across 25 centuries from a Hebrew legal term, Persian cosmic dualism, Greek goat gods, the political needs of competing religious communities, a non-canonical Jewish literature of fallen angels, and the imaginative genius of an English poet. He is, in the oldest layer of the tradition, a lawyer. The kingdom was always someone else's. The throne was always a fiction. This is the oldest lie of all. Not that hell exists, but that its geography was ever simple, its administration ever settled, its nature ever obvious. From a legal term, in a Hebrew courtroom, we arrive at the place where this whole journey began, at the one moment in the history of hell where the myth and the physical earth made contact, where you could walk to the entrance, watch an animal die at the threshold, and call it the breath of the underworld because you had no other words. The gates of hell were real, and they killed on command. The year is somewhere in the 2nd century before the Common Era. You are standing on a travertine plateau above the Meander River Valley in what is now western Turkey. Around you is a functioning Greco-Roman city. Temples, a theater cut into the hillside, columned walkways, the sounds of commerce and prayer. And at the edge of a shrine dedicated to the god of the underworld, a priest leads a bull toward a low opening in the rock. The bull approaches. It staggers. It falls. It is dead before anyone touches it. The priest steps back, untouched, and the crowd watching from the steps above understands that they have witnessed exactly what they came to witness, the breath of Hades rising from below. This happened. It was documented by multiple ancient writers working independently across several centuries. And in 2013, Italian archaeologist Francesco D'Andrea of the University of Salento confirmed the rediscovery of the site after it had been considered lost for centuries. the Plutonian at Hierapolis, a cave sanctuary dedicated to Pluto and Persephone, located in what is now the Turkish town of Pamukkale, is not a myth. It is a documented, excavated, physically present archaeological site that you can visit today. The ancient documentation is extensive and specific. Strabo, the Greek geographer who lived from approximately 64 before the Common Era to 24 of the Common Era, described the Plutonian in his Geographica with matter-of-fact precision. He wrote of throwing sparrows into the cave and watching them fall dead instantly. He described the atmosphere around the entrance as immediately lethal to animals. He described the priests of Cybele entering and surviving, and expressed his own wonder at their apparent immunity. Cicero referenced it. Plutarch referenced it. Iamblichus, the Neoplatonist philosopher of the 3rd and 4th centuries of the Common Era, referenced it. The site was not obscure. For approximately 7 centuries, from the Hellenistic period through the Roman imperial era, it was a functioning and well-documented religious destination. D'Andrea's team confirmed the identification in 2013 by matching the physical features of the excavated site to the ancient descriptions. The Ionic columns, the sacred pool, the tiered steps descending toward the cave opening, the positioning relative to the temple of Apollo. The match was exact. The site had not moved. The cave was still there. In 2018, geoscientist Hardy Fons and colleagues from the University of Duisburg-Essen published measurements of the cave's atmospheric chemistry. At ground level inside the cave, they found carbon dioxide concentrations reaching 91%, instantly lethal to any animal whose head was near the ground. At human standing height, concentrations ranged from 35 to 53%, dangerous over time but not immediately fatal. The source of the carbon dioxide was volcanic. The site sits directly above the Babadag Fault, and volcanic activity continuously pumps gas through the fissure. The concentrations are highest at dawn, when cool air keeps the heavier gas settled low to the ground, and decrease through the day as the air warms and circulates. This is why the sparrows died and the priests lived. The sparrows' heads were at ground level. The priests were standing upright. The lethality was not supernatural, it was chemistry. The priests of Cybele, who reportedly survived extended time inside the cave, according to ancient sources who marveled at this, may have been trained in breath-holding practices or may have developed a degree of physiological tolerance or may have simply known from experience how long they could remain before the gas accumulated to dangerous levels at human height. Fans's measurements confirmed that Strabo's sparrow test, conducted approximately 2,000 years earlier, was accurate in every particular. The mainstream scientific explanation is both complete and satisfying. Naturally occurring carbon dioxide from a volcanic fault line pooled at ground level in a cave. Ancient people observed that animals entering the cave died and humans survived. They interpreted this through the theological framework they had, which was one in which the underworld was physically present in the landscape, accessible through specific geographic features and associated with divine power. The Plutonian was not evidence of the supernatural. It was a natural phenomenon interpreted through a supernatural framework by people who lacked the atmospheric chemistry to explain what they were seeing. But something in that explanation deserves a second look. The priests at Hierapolis did not simply stumble on a cave that killed animals and build a myth around it. They built an entire religious infrastructure over 7 centuries, a temple, a theater for audiences to watch the demonstrations, tiered steps designed to position observers at a safe distance while animals entered at ground level, a sacred pool, a complex of supporting architecture. They conducted repeatable demonstrations with predictable results. They knew that dawn was different from noon. They knew that birds died faster than bulls. They knew where to stand. They knew how long they could stay. That is not superstition. That is observation. That is controlled, repeated, empirical observation of a natural phenomenon encoded in religious ritual and maintained across generations. The priests of the Platonian were not deceiving their audiences in the modern sense. They were demonstrating something real that they genuinely could not explain, using the explanatory framework available to them, which was the breath of Hades, the boundary between the living world and the world below. Some researchers ask whether this pattern, empirical observation of a natural phenomenon encoded in religious practice and transmitted through ritual, might be more common in the ancient world than we typically assume. Whether the gates of hell, in other ancient traditions, the cave of Avernus in Italy, whose volcanic gases killed birds flying over it and gave it its Greek name meaning without birds, the Necromantian in Epirus, where the ancient oracle of the dead operated, various other sites across the Mediterranean identified in ancient sources as underworld entrances, might similarly correspond to real geological anomalies that have not yet been measured with modern instruments. Whether ancient people, precisely because they lacked modern chemistry and therefore lacked the dismissive explanation, paid closer empirical attention to what they observed than we have given them credit for. The Plutonian was sealed sometime in late antiquity, almost certainly by early Christians for whom a functioning pagan shrine claiming to be hell's entrance was theologically intolerable. The cave was closed. The site was abandoned. The documentation survived in libraries. And 2,000 years after Strabo watched the sparrows fall, a team of Italian archaeologists matched his description to a cave in Turkey, and a team of German scientists confirmed that he had been telling the truth all along. This is the oldest and most important lie about hell. Not that it doesn't exist, but that everything we think we know about it, its location, its administration, its nature, its duration, its gatekeepers, is settled and ancient and obvious. None of it is. Every item in this video pointed to the same discovery: that the hell familiar to billions of people is a construction, assembled across 3,000 years from a gray Hebrew shadowland, a real valley in Jerusalem, a volcanic cave in Turkey, a drowned cosmology in the Yucatan, a suppressed universalism in Alexandria, a poet's borrowed map in Florence, a borrowed image from a Greek goat god, a disputed clause in a creed, a mathematician's obsession in India, and a pastoral hypothesis that was presented as doctrine for 16 centuries before its own institution quietly admitted it had never been required to be believed. These are not 10 separate mistakes. They are 10 windows into the same process, the process by which human beings, in every culture, in every era, take the most urgent questions they face. What happens when we die? Does what we do matter? Is there justice anywhere in the universe? And build answers that are necessarily incomplete, necessarily provisional, necessarily shaped by the political and institutional and psychological needs of the moment. The answers harden into doctrine. The doctrine hardens into certainty, and the certainty obscures the questions underneath, which were never answered, only silenced. The mainstream view of this process is not without merit. Religious traditions exist because they serve real human needs. The moral architecture that hell provided, the sense that actions have consequences, that justice exists even when it cannot be seen in this life, that the suffering of the innocent is not simply the last word on the matter, answered something genuine in human experience. Whatever its origins, whatever its distortions, the concept of hell has been doing real work in human civilization for 3,000 years. You cannot dismiss that simply by tracing the word back to a valley outside Jerusalem. But the alternative view cannot be dismissed either. If the hell that has shaped Western civilization's moral psychology, its criminal justice systems, its political obedience, its deepest fears about the nature of existence was assembled from mistranslations, political theology, suppressed universalisms, borrowed Islamic maps, and hypotheses dressed as doctrine, then the certainty with which it was wielded was never warranted. And the suffering produced by that certainty, the grief of parents told their children were in limbo, the communities shaped by fear of a Satan who was always a prosecuting attorney rather than a king, the theologians silenced for reading the same texts and reaching more merciful conclusions, that suffering was produced by confident answers to questions that were never as settled as the confident answers implied. What these 10 items mean for our understanding of history is not that ancient people were wrong. It is that they were human. They were doing exactly what we do, taking the evidence available to them, passing it through the frameworks available to them, and producing answers they could live with. Some of those answers were better than others. Some were suppressed because they were inconvenient. Some survived because they were useful. And the ones that survived were not necessarily the truest. They were the ones that served the most powerful interests in the moments that mattered. Most people move through the world without questioning the furniture of inherited certainty. The word hell, the image of Satan, the underground geography, the eternal duration. These feel as old and immovable as the mountains because they are everywhere. You are not most people. You followed this thread across 3,000 years and 6 continents and came out the other side knowing something about how ideas are built, how they are transmitted, how they are managed, and what gets lost in the management. That is not a small thing. That is exactly the kind of knowledge that changes how you see everything else. This channel exists for people who ask that kind of question, who look at what everyone accepts without examination and say, but where did that come from? And who decided it? And what did they leave out? If that is you, subscribe, because this is what we do here every week. And leave a comment. Which of these 10 lies surprised you most? Which one changed something you thought you knew? The word hell is older than the religion that made it famous. It has been a gray silence, a valley, a cave mouth, a borrowed map, a suppressed hope, a legal term turned king, a hypothesis turned doctrine. In every form it took, it was an answer to the same question. Does what happens here, in this one brief life, matter beyond the moment it ends? The people who built Hierapolis's Plutonian, who mapped Xibalba in the dark, who wrote Sheol's silence and Gehenna's fire and Naraka's 100 levels and Dante's 9 circles, whatever they got wrong, they were asking the right question. It turns out the question is more interesting than any answer that has ever been given for it. Keep asking, subscribe, and we'll keep looking together.